Rain hammered the tin roof of the testing shed at Farnborough, drowning the distant hum of aircraft engines. The air smelled of burnt oil and fear, the kind of fear that comes not from enemy fire, but from knowing the world is unraveling faster than anyone can stop it. It was 1940, and the British Army was desperate. German armour had torn through Europe like a steel avalanche, its 75mm guns shredding Allied defences with terrifying ease. Inside that shed stood a man few noticed, a soft-spoken engineer named Ted Hallam, hunched over tables cluttered with layers of resin-coated cardboard, wires and clamps. His idea seemed ludicrous to most. Could a simple composite of pressed paper, hardened and laminated, absorb the fury of modern artillery? The soldiers called it cardboard armor, laughing as they smoked and shared rumors of this mad scientist wasting time and government resources. But Ted worked with the patience of a man possessed. His first failures were violent and messy. Sheets of fiber cracked, layers separated, glue and resin sprayed across the floor, and yet he continued, adjusting thickness, pressing, curing, until finally a sample remained intact after repeated impact tests. Each success was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight heavier than steel, the possibility that human ingenuity might carve a sliver of safety out of the madness of war. The day of the major test was cold and silent. Fog clung to the rolling hills outside Farnborough, muting the morning sun. A dozen officers, some curious, others mocking, watched as a small mock turret, clad in Ted's cardboard armor, was wheeled into position beside an old Churchill tank. The gunner adjusted his sights, loaded a 75mm shell, and fired at the steel tank. The armor buckled and cracked, sending shards flying, as expected. Then the gunners turned to Ted's creation. Hearts thumped in the misty morning air. The shell screamed toward the mock turret, and when the smoke cleared, the impossible had happened. The shell had not penetrated. Officers who had laughed moments before stood silent, their disbelief etched into their faces. Ted felt no triumph. There was only the quiet, heavy realization that his madness might actually save lives. Weeks turned into months, and the war demanded more than experiments. By 1943, the Allies were preparing for Operation Overlord, and resources were stretched thin. Steel was scarce, production lines overburdened, and commanders were desperate for any advantage. Ted's material, now officially dubbed composite paper laminate armor, found unexpected interest. It was lightweight, flexible, and, if layered correctly, surprisingly resilient. Soldiers began seeing its use not on tanks but on transport carriers, scout cars, and decoy vehicles. Dock workers laughed at crates stamped Experimental Armor Division, mocking them as if Britain had gone mad. Yet in the mud and chaos of northern France, these seemingly absurd creations proved their worth. One night, Ted observed a convoy of experimental trucks being loaded with supplies. Rain slicked roads, dark shadows of hedgerows, the constant drone of distant artillery. The environment was brutal. He imagined the German shells that might strike these trucks and felt a hollow dread. In his office in Farnborough, he meticulously documented the tests, noting energy absorption, layer thickness, and resilience against different calibers. Each number on his charts represented a life that might be spared. By D-Day, Ted was in Normandy, witnessing the horror he had only ever imagined in sketches and test logs. The beaches were a graveyard of steel, flesh, and fire. Sherman and Cromwell tanks burned, men screamed, and smoke thickened the morning fog. Amid the chaos, he spotted one of his experimental carriers. It was riddled with impact marks, blackened from blasts, yet the crew, young soldiers barely old enough to vote, survived. Private Lyle, a gunner, pointed to a dented panel and whispered, "Took a 75 to the side, sir. Didn't even come through." Ted knelt beside the vehicle, hands hovering over the warped cardboard layers, feeling the strange, almost organic resilience of his creation. Around them, the battle raged, yet in this small moment, the madness of paper against steel felt victorious. Despite proof, war bureaucracy was relentless. Orders came swiftly. The project was to be halted, labeled non-standard and unreliable. Brass could not stomach trusting soldiers' lives to paper. But whispers among the troops told another story, tales of a strange material that could stop a 75mm shell, rumors spreading from Normandy to the rear supply lines. Soldiers marked their vehicles with small white squares, a silent tribute to the invention that kept them alive in the mud and smoke. Ted returned to England, his project shelved, his reputation a footnote in the vast machinery of war. Yet the stories of survival travelled, carried by soldiers who would never forget the cardboard that had defied bullets and shells. Back at Farnborough, Ted continued his work in secret, refining layers, testing new resins, exploring the limits of his invention. Every day the world outside changed, cities burned, men died, and battles raged far from his lab. Yet he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that life could be saved in the most improbable ways. Each layer pressed, each sheet hardened, was a quiet rebellion against the brutal arithmetic of war. By the end of 1944, while steel dominated battlefields and mechanized forces surged, Ted's laminated armor had become a silent, almost invisible guardian. In hedgerows, villages, and makeshift depots, his creations endured where metal failed. Soldiers told stories of the miracle cardboard, of trucks struck again and again, panels cracked but interiors untouched, men emerging alive to swear by the strange invention no one believed. When the war finally ended, Ted Hallam faded into history's shadows. Newspapers never reported on the quiet heroics of cardboard against steel. Yet decades later, rusted vehicle hulls discovered in French hedgerows still bore the layered laminates, a faint testament to innovation born in desperation. The men who had ridden behind his creations remembered, passing down stories to children and grandchildren, tales of survival against impossible odds. Ted lived quietly, tinkering, hands always stained with resin, mind always turning toward the improbable, the overlooked, the miraculous. His cardboard armor became legend, a ghost of ingenuity that had, in its own humble way, defied death and the tyranny of war. The dawn over the Ardennes was a grey smear of fog and cold, broken only by the distant rumble of engines and the nervous chatter of soldiers. December 16, 1944, and the Battle of the Bulge had begun. German panzers carved through snow-covered villages with ruthless precision, their 75mm and 88mm guns spitting fire and steel. The Allies were caught off guard, the lines stretched thin, and every man on the front felt the suffocating grip of fear. Among them was Corporal James Hargrove, barely 22, gripping the steering wheel of a supply carrier fitted with the controversial cardboard armor. Men around him laughed at the ridiculous-looking panels, scoffing at the idea that paper could stop a shell. Yet James drove through the icy roads with a grim determination, the smell of burning fuel mingling with the sharp, metallic scent of gunfire. Explosions cracked in the distance, shattering the silence and echoing across frozen forests, as if the earth itself were crying under the weight of war. The first ambush came just past a crumbling bridge. German tanks rolled from the mist, their cannons aimed with lethal precision. James froze for a heartbeat, then drove straight into the firestorm. Shells tore through trees and churned the snow into a storm of wood and ice. One hit the side of his truck, and the world seemed to slow. He braced himself for death, sweat stinging his eyes. When the smoke cleared, the cardboard armor had held. The shell had dented the panels, but not penetrated. The driver next to him stared in disbelief, muttering curses and awe in the same breath. That moment changed everything for those who survived. The mad invention was no longer a joke, but a fragile shield against annihilation. The convoy pressed forward through destroyed villages and twisted wreckage. Soldiers sloshed through icy mud, hauling ammunition and wounded comrades. Bombed-out buildings whispered stories of families lost, the wind carrying the faint, bitter scent of smoke and decay. James's truck rumbled over frozen streams, panels groaning under the cold and impact, yet holding fast. At a crossroads, a Panther tank appeared from behind a ridge, its gun trained on the convoy. The commanding officer yelled for the men to scatter. Heart-pounding, James turned the wheel sharply, hitting a patch of ice, sliding perilously. The shell tore through the air, striking the side of his truck. Metal screamed as the impact rippled through the panels, but again the laminated armor absorbed the blow. Men clung to the truck in stunned silence, realizing that a miracle had become reality. Ingenuity could carve a moment of survival from the jaws of destruction. The day wore on, a relentless march of chaos. Snow turned red in the footprints of fallen soldiers, and cries echoed through the forest like ghosts of the dead. James moved through villages turned tombs, seeing tanks burning, trucks shredded, men pinned under debris. Yet every time his truck took a hit, the cardboard armor held. Engineers who had once mocked the panels were now hailed in whispered reverence. The improbable sheets of hardened fiber and resin were keeping men alive. At one village, a shell struck the rear door of a supply truck, denting but not breaching. Corporal Hargrove climbed out, hands shaking, touching the warped panel as if it were a talisman. Around him, men shared a quiet, haunted smile, knowing that luck alone did not explain this survival, only the strange, fragile genius of a man far from the battlefield. Night fell, cold and unyielding, yet the battle did not pause. Fires lit the horizon, casting grotesque shadows over frozen fields. German patrols prowled, seeking stragglers, while Allied forces scrambled to regroup. James and his convoy navigated the snowy backroads, dodging ambushes and artillery fire. Every dent, crack, and scorch mark on his truck told a story of survival, each one a silent testament to the power of innovation against destruction. Soldiers huddled in the cab, exhausted and terrified, sharing whispered prayers, cigarette smoke curling in the frigid air. Somewhere in the chaos, a young medic checked the wounded, murmuring promises of survival he could not keep. Yet the truck moved, carrying men through the storm of death, the cardboard armor defying logic and fate alike. By morning, the landscape had transformed into a battlefield, frozen in time. Tanks burned like fallen gods, supply convoys were shattered, and the cries of the wounded lingered over the snow like an unshakable shadow. James stopped beside a demolished village, surveying the devastation. His truck bore scars from countless impacts, yet the men inside were alive, their hands gripping ammunition boxes, their faces pale and rigid from fear. A shell had nearly hit the fuel tank, an explosion narrowly avoided. He pressed a hand to the side panel, feeling the cold dent, and understood that survival in war was often a combination of chance and ingenuity. The cardboard armor had become more than a prototype. It was a symbol of hope, fragile yet steadfast, a whisper of defiance in a war that showed no mercy. Across the Ardennes, other experimental vehicles were proving the same. Each dented panel was a story, each intact interior a miracle. Soldiers began to share tales of the paper tanks, laughing nervously at first, then in awe. Engineers in London read telegrams from the front, learning that their odd invention, once ridiculed, was saving lives. Reports came in of entire convoys surviving shell fire that would have shredded ordinary steel, men alive to tell the story. In foxholes, exhausted and frozen, soldiers would point to dented panels and murmur, almost superstitiously, "That's the miracle truck." These small stories spread, a chain of survival threaded through the chaos, whispering across the cold forests and shattered roads. As the battle dragged on, the cost became impossible to ignore. Bodies littered the snow, the stench of smoke and blood heavy in the air. Tanks and trucks smoldered, the screams of the wounded mixing with the roar of artillery. Yet every time a cardboard-armored vehicle survived, it was a small victory in a landscape dominated by death. James drove through the wreckage, seeing comrades fall, yet understanding that the fragile invention in his hands was more than a shield. It was proof that human ingenuity could confront the relentless mechanical terror of war. The Ardennes was cruel, unyielding and unforgiving, yet the survivors of the convoy carried a story back to London, a story that blurred the line between miracle and invention. By the time the German advance was halted and the snow began to melt into a grey, muddy battlefield, the experimental vehicles had become legend. Soldiers shared their tales over whispered fires, the cardboard trucks that had defied 75mm shells, that had carried men through hell and back. Engineers received letters from the front, soldiers begging for more of the improbable armor. The war machine was brutal, relentless, and total, yet in small pockets human creativity and courage had carved survival from the jaws of annihilation. For every dented panel, every miracle saved life, there was a reminder. Even in the darkest hours, innovation and courage could make the impossible real. The sun rose weakly over the shattered countryside of Europe, pale light struggling to pierce the smoke and haze of December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge had ended, but the scars of war stretched far beyond the forests and villages where men had fought and died. Corporal James Hargrove, now older in ways the war had forced upon him, stepped out of a supply truck, dented and scarred, panels still bearing the marks of 75mm shells. Around him, soldiers cleared frozen bodies and burned out vehicles, the cold wind carrying the bitter scent of loss and the faint, metallic tang of spilled blood. The cardboard armor that had saved him and his comrades was now a quiet testament to resilience, its layers warped and blackened, but unbroken. Each panel was a memory, a life spared when death had come knocking. He touched a warped corner, tracing the jagged lines where the steel might have passed through, and felt the weight of both survival and responsibility. For weeks, Allied forces had worked to push the Germans back, reclaiming towns and villages where houses had been reduced to splintered ruins. Soldiers who had once mocked the mad cardboard armor now spoke of it with reverent awe, telling new recruits that it was more than paper. It was ingenuity hardened by desperation. In one small village, James helped a young medic carry the wounded to temporary field hospitals. Shivering children peered from ruined homes, their eyes wide with fear and distrust, while parents silently mourned the lives the fighting had stolen. The convoy of cardboard armored trucks rumbled over frozen mud, carrying supplies, ammunition, and hope. Each dented panel whispered stories of survival: the driver who had taken a shell to the side, the scout who had escaped a panther's fire, the convoy that had emerged from ambushes that should have been death traps. In these small victories, the war seemed momentarily human again. Yet the cost was undeniable. Corpses lay in hedgerows, soldiers' faces frozen in expressions of terror, and tanks that had roared like beasts now smouldered in quiet ashes. James walked among them, hands trembling, knowing that for every panel that had saved a life, countless others had been lost. The cardboard armor was fragile, a small shield against the overwhelming might of mechanized warfare. Still, it had proven that ingenuity could tilt fate, that in the endless calculus of death and destruction, human creativity could carve a sliver of survival. Engineers back in London documented every success, every dent and deflection, sending reports up the chain of command, even as brass debated whether to invest in such non-standard technology. But for the men on the ground, there was no debate. The cardboard had spoken in the only language that mattered: survival. By early 1945, Allied forces were advancing into Germany, and James's unit moved through towns that had never seen liberation until now. The devastation was unimaginable. Rubble lined the streets, churches reduced to walls, families scattered or gone. Soldiers scavenged what they could, taking care to preserve the cardboard armored vehicles that had become their lifeline. Shells and bullets had scarred every panel, yet inside, men had emerged alive, whispering thanks to a man they would never meet, a quiet engineer in England who had pressed, layered, and hardened sheets of paper into shields against death. James paused in one ruined town square, staring at a supply truck whose side was dented from repeated impacts. He traced the damage, imagining the shell that had struck it, imagining the men inside and the lives saved. The sun broke through the smoke, casting golden light on the warped panels, almost like a benediction. In quieter moments, James and his comrades reflected on the strange duality of war, horror and heroism intertwined in ways that made sense only to those who had lived through it. He remembered Private Lyle, whose hands had shaken as he touched a panel that had taken a direct hit, and the young medic who had whispered prayers over the wounded in a snow-filled field hospital. The cardboard armor was more than material. It was memory, courage, and ingenuity crystallized into something tangible. As the Allies pressed into the heart of Germany, every convoy that moved under the protection of these fragile panels carried not just supplies but hope, a reminder that even in the darkest machinery of war, human thought and skill could prevail. James began to understand that the war was not just battles and tanks and artillery, it was survival, adaptation, and the ingenuity of ordinary people facing extraordinary danger. Back in England, Ted Hallam, the quiet engineer, continued his work in secret, refining the laminates, exploring new materials, and testing the limits of human ingenuity against the endless appetite of war. By the time victory was declared in May 1945, he had left a legacy not recorded in newspapers or celebrated in parades, but etched in the dented panels and lives of soldiers across Europe. Letters from the front described the miracles of survival, stories that spread among troops and engineers alike. In quiet moments, survivors would point to the warped edges and blackened layers, whispering, "This saved us!" The cardboard had defied the impossible, absorbing shells, bullets, and human disbelief alike. It was a testament to the intersection of desperation and creativity, a fragile invention that proved that even the humblest idea could alter fate on the battlefield. As the world slowly began to rebuild, James returned home, haunted by the faces of comrades lost and grateful for those who survived. He carried with him no medals, no fanfare, only memories of frozen forests, burning villages, and the fragile armor that had shielded him from death. He often thought of Ted, the man who had risked ridicule to save lives, a ghostly presence in the machinery of war, shaping survival from the edge of imagination. In letters passed among veterans, the story of the cardboard trucks lived on, a whispered legend, a proof that in human hands even paper could become armor. In barracks and campfires, soldiers shared tales of vehicles that had defied shells, reminding each other that ingenuity could exist even amid total destruction. These stories became part of the collective memory of a war defined by both horror and human courage. In the end, the cardboard armor was more than an invention. It was a symbol of resilience against impossible odds, of courage hidden in quiet ingenuity, of lives saved where the machinery of war sought only to destroy. Soldiers who had survived returned home, carrying memories of frozen fields, dented panels, and comrades who had fallen. They shared these stories with families, ensuring that the legend of the cardboard armor endured. Ted Hallam, the man whose vision had seemed absurd, lived quietly, but his invention echoed across time, proving that even in the darkest chapters of history, human creativity could triumph. The war had taken so much, but in small, miraculous ways, it had also revealed what humans were capable of: resilience, innovation, and the will to survive. Until next time, stay safe and see you in the next history video.